Hey, good morning. This is Joe Yudin from Touring Israel Luxury Private Tours. And today, on our third episode of the podcast, we're with tour guide extraordinaire Bena Mantel. Hi, Bena. How are you doing this morning?
Good morning, Joe. Good morning, guys. Morning, everyone.
Good to see you. We're a couple of weeks into the coronavirus outbreak lockdown here in Israel. You getting a little stir crazy?
That's exactly right.
All right.
By the beard is showing.
Right, terrific. So, for all you out there who don't know who Bena is, he's one of the top tour guides here in Israel, one of the most in-demand tour guides in Israel. He has a very interesting background. Why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself, Bena?
All right, where to start? Let's see.
Where did you grow up? Where were you born? Where are your parents from? Where are your
I'll
grandparents
tell you a little
from?
bit about it. I am from a small town called Ra'anana, which is just north of Tel Aviv. It is often considered the English-speaking capital of Israel. I am the firstborn in my family after we made Aliyah. In other words, after the family immigrated from the States. I have 9 siblings. So my mom's Israeli. She met my dad when he was writing his dissertation in Hebrew University in Jerusalem, and he met my mother. She was actually just graduating high school, and long story short, they dated briefly, got married, went back to the States, where he completed his PhD in Yale University, and then all the while my mother was having children. First in New Jersey, then the family moved to Boston. He was teaching at Harvard, then on to Yale University, and they moved to New Haven. Had 5 kids all together in the States. Last university, I think, was Northwestern in Chicago. And then they immigrated to Israel with 5 kids, and both got jobs in university of the Israelis. So that made it, and all around Mantels. Um, that's as far as the personal background story. As a child in Ra'anana with 9 siblings, this wasn't just an academic family. This was also an Orthodox family. So dad was both a professor but also a rabbi, and a rabbi of 2 different synagogues, modern Orthodox synagogues that he would be the rabbi of, and we would be there on Friday evenings, and an ultra-Orthodox synagogue that we went to on Saturday mornings. And he was basically performing as rabbi in both places, which is very unheard of. And very confusing for a child who's not sure if he's ultra-Orthodox or modern Orthodox or what's his story. An ultra-Orthodox school, but B'nai Akiva modern Orthodox youth movement. So I guess I was always skirting both societies. Eventually, I went to a modern Orthodox high school yeshiva, so I guess that was the bon ton. That was definitely what I guess we were more of, which also meant military service and everything that goes with that. It's a complicated one.
What did you do in the military?
So 3 years military service in a combat unit. I was an artillery soldier.
Were you still religious at this point?
At this point, I'm already not a religious, definitely not by conventional standards of being religious. I'm not wearing a kippah at this point in my life, and I still wash my hands before having a BLT. But that's sort of
right. Okay. Was there a specific incident that you decided not to be religious? I don't know if you saw the new Netflix show Unorthodox, which is extremely popular around the world, about a Haredi Satmar woman who just got married, who leaves the sect and flees to Germany and becomes secular. I don't know if you saw that, but it's a very interesting topic today. Why would an ultra-Orthodox person leave that world, and how did that affect you and your family? And was there anything that specifically triggered that?
So The short answer is that, and I have watched the show, by the way, and I thought the show was great. I could say a couple of things. First and foremost, thank God I wasn't born Satmar. It means that that in my family, we were always a very open-minded, relativist sort of family. And Dad was a rabbi, but he was also a Jewish philosopher. I dare say he was first and foremost a Jewish philosopher. So he was not about to push away his kids. Yiddish was not the spoken language. It was the language that was used for us kids not to understand what the parents are saying. So I had to take Yiddish in the university. Many, many years later in my master's, I took Yiddish so that I'll finally understand what were those things that my parents were saying when I was a young boy. But the truth is, and I have noticed this about unorthodox as well, is that they sort of skirted around and they did not bother going too much into the process of deciding to leave the education and the upbringing, and I dare say the indoctrination that comes with growing in a very orthodox background. You're not really encouraged to ask questions. You're not encouraged to challenge the way of life. And in an ultra-Orthodox society, it's the worst thing you can do. As well, in a modern Orthodox society, is something that they are better prepared for. It's a process. I think a lot of people go through the process, sometimes in their adolescent years, in their teens. And I think that for the most part, the system is prepared to give you the answers to allow you to stay on course. The more inquisitive ones and perhaps the more rebellious type may not find the answer sufficient, and that's in a short version what happened with me. So I started the process at 16. I was still in the yeshiva high school. I even graduated the yeshiva high school, although I already knew that I wasn't religious at the time, and I even went on to a yeshiva which kept me full-time after high school, just before the military for a few months in the city of Hebron, deep in the West Bank, south of Jerusalem, where the patriarchs were buried, the fathers and the mothers, the matriarchs, of course, as well, are buried there as well in the city of Hebron. And I spent a good couple of months there. And then I could come back to my mom and say, hey, you know, I tried this outside the confines of high school. This isn't my life. Nobody said Kaddish on me and nobody mourned me. I'm still a part of the family. Today's Friday, so I already called this morning. I called my mother to say Shabbat Shalom. So definitely not exactly the unorthodox version of becoming unorthodox.
Terrific. So Bena, you studied archaeology in university. And you said you had your master's. Is your master's in archaeology?
So I studied my BA. I was a double major. For the first degree, I was a Bible and archaeology major. And then for the master's degree, I basically stuck straight only with the archaeology. I was about to write a dissertation about the Persian period. That did not happen, unfortunately, due to the passing of my professor, Hanan Eshel. And at that point, I was looking for a different path, and what I ended up doing is writing a lot of small seminary works instead of a large thesis. But yeah, I did complete my master's in archaeology of the classic periods. So it was mainly the Persian, the Greek, and of course the Roman, and even a little bit of the Byzantine. Could definitely considered the end of the classics.
And when I met you, you were the site director at an archaeological dig at Beit Guvrin Marasha, which is an interesting site with ancient Canaanite, Israelite, Greek, Roman, Byzantine, Crusader ruins. I mean, it's an archaeologist's dream to be a site director there. And you were doing I believe you were doing the tour guide course at the same time. What made you decide when you were an archaeologist that you wanted to be a tour guide as well?
That's a very good question. Well, the truth is, by the way, that I was a tour guide even before. When I graduated high school and while I was in yeshiva, I'm always trying to cram things and push things together. I was already getting my first licensing to become a tour guide. That one was with the Ministry of Education. In other words, that one focuses mainly on domestic tourism. And I was working a lot with Israeli groups, whether they were Israeli school kids going on their school trip or Israeli adults. They're looking for some extra traveling slash extra training. That was my first qualification. And once I was working as a tour guide, I was looking for a way to combine tour guiding, which really is the only job I ever had, with archaeology, which was what I was now studying, archaeology and Bible, and I stumbled on the site at Maresha at Beit Guvrin. While I was there, I also discovered that Beit Guvrin essentially has the same company that operated the dig. We're having a tour guide course that licenses you through the Ministry of Tourism, which now allows you in Israel to guide incoming tourism. In other words, tourists that are coming in. And so I became the site manager there, but I also took the tour guiding course and bundled it all together. So that's how that started with getting my license to work with incoming tourism. And before long, I realized, and that's the sad truth of the matter, that although I love guiding and I love archaeology, I cannot be an archaeologist full time. It was just too difficult in Israel. Archaeologists work for the Department of Antiquities, which is siphoned from the Prime Minister's office, which essentially means that although archaeology is huge in Israel, it doesn't pay very well. That's the bottom line. And I had to make a choice if I want to be a full-time archaeologist and live a minimum wage salary for basically the rest of my adult life, or maybe I try to do a little better than that and become a tour guide. And that's what I decided on doing. So the career became tour guiding. I still love archaeology, and the best thing about my job is that I get to talk about it and I get to visit those sites on a regular basis.
Great. So as a tour guide slash archaeologist, what are some of your favorite sites around Israel? And maybe you want to discuss a certain period in the long history of this land, which is time immemorial, really. The beginning of history starts here in the Levant, between Mesopotamia and ancient Egypt. So what are some of your favorite sites? What are your favorite subjects? What are you into now? Perhaps we can discuss one of these subjects.
So, an interesting topic. First of all, like you said, this is the cradle of civilization. I mean, we see civilizations south and north of us, but it seems to have a process here which combines the two and then shoots it back out to the rest of the known world. And we can see societies here going well before what we would consider conventional archaeology. In other words, tens of thousands of years old. The archaeology which we for the most part work with in Israel, with the exception again of what's happening perhaps in the south and some of the nomadic societies that Beersheba University is doing some research on that takes you back over 10,000 years. For the most part here in Israel, we start seeing, like you said, from Canaanite, in other words, from 3,500 years ago, we start to have substantial archaeological evidence that will allow us to make some kind of a picture, build some sort of perception of what life was at the time. For me, places like Maresha, places that are more focused with the Greek, Roman, and Byzantine periods, that takes me back for the most part all the way to 2,400 years ago at the very earliest, and then probably already going all the way into the 6th or the 7th centuries, where 1,400 years ago, we're already stepping into an entirely different period here, an entirely different time frame. So those were the 1,000 years that I think really got me interested. And one of the things that I've noticed is that there are a couple of dark spots in those periods. The first one would probably be the Persian period. This is a period that we find very little archaeological evidence. we actually find a decent amount of archaeological evidence, but not one that allows us to make any sort of statements that will be substantial about it. In other words,
So it's interesting. It's interesting that you say that. You know, as you know, Purim has just passed, and the whole story of Purim is that in 586 BCE, the Babylonians and Nebuchadnezzar, they come to ancient Israel. They destroy the later kingdom of Judea and Jerusalem and the temple, and he takes away the Jews, most of them, not all of them, away to Babylonia. And we know about 50 years later, King Cyrus of Persia, he conquers Babylonia, and he gives his edict, and he tells the Jews to go home and build their temple. Some people return, most of them don't. Well, what do they find? According to the archaeology, okay, did that happen, number one? And number two, when the Jews came back, who were the Jews that came back? What did they find? What did they build? And what's the archaeology in this dark period, as you call it, which is probably the darkest period in our history, even though we have this story in the Bible? What can we grasp?
It seems like we have a wonderful story which is told to us in the book of Esther, in Megillat Esther, about events that are taking place in the city of Shushan. We know where Shushan is. Unfortunately, we cannot travel to Shushan right now. Iran is not exactly an open border. The rest of the Persian period is in the country of Iraq, which is also not exactly a popular destination these days. So the archaeology of those,
that's for sure.
Not for Israeli. True. Yeah, I mean, for others, perhaps. I wouldn't even take my American passport and try to go to Iraq anytime soon. But that's beside the point. You're absolutely right. We do have written material. We have a decent amount of descriptions, whether it's in the Bible itself. The book of Daniel takes place in the end of the Persian period, but as Bible books, they are not worried about giving you a historical description. They may give you things that you will be able to later extrapolate, but in the end of the day, they are not historical by nature. And the archaeology is tough as well, because the Persians spent some time here. But they did not develop this place very much. In fact, what we see with the Persians is an imperialistic aspiration which takes Jews out of here and spreads them in other places. Jews were always wandering Jews, and I can tell you that even when Jews returned here after the Babylonian exile and after the demise of the Babylonians by the Persians, when Cyrus allows Jews to come back, we see the return in the times of Sheshbatzar, and we don't see a great return, and that's something that's very interesting. So is Sheshbatzar that the Bible talks about in the book of Ezra, at the beginning of the book of Ezra, is he Zerubbabel, or is he a separate character? And Zerubbabel is another person which is trying to encourage Jews to return from the Persian Empire back into their homeland. Whether they are one or they are two, the book of Ezra is not entirely clear on that, and it really depends who you ask.
And Zerubbabel is actually the one who builds the first version of the second.
Exactly. So they're coming back to their land that they have been promised, and they're all very excited, but not everyone is coming. The ones who are coming seem to be enjoying the benefactors who are staying back home. So the Jews who are staying in the Persian period will basically tell them, hey, you go and start working on bringing the land back to what it was, and we will support you financially. Right. Perhaps a beginning of diaspora Jews who are doing well outside of the promised land, telling the ones who are brave enough, hey, you go, take the bullet, be there for the rest of us, have Jewish continuity, we will support you financially however way we can. Right. And then Ezra shows up. And
So
Ezra,
before you get into Ezra, so basically, if you were a Jew living in Persia for about 70 years by now, you were doing well, as we hear in the book of Esther, even according to the Bible anyway, we rise and become a part of everyday society, even one of the queens. So who are the Jews who go back? They're probably either one of two kinds of Jews. Very poor,
right?
usually men, right? Not women, because, probably single men. And number two, idealists, maybe the first Zionists. So those are probably the Jews who are returning to Judea at the time, correct?
Absolutely. These are young men. These are people who, again, they don't need any convincing. It sounds like they would have come here with or without the support of their Jewish benefactors who stayed behind. But it's not enough to reestablish what was here. It's far from it. Even at the moment when the Jews finally finished building the second temple after the first was destroyed. And by the way, that happened in intervals because not everyone here wants there to be a temple built. And some of the Jews who stayed here are sort of changing their ways. And of course, where are the other social groups that have entered here while the Jews were gone?
Sounds familiar.
Yeah, exactly, right? History just repeats itself all the time. But even when they're finally building the second temple, the older men who are here, who are witnessing the second temple that is being built, are sad. They're saddened because they remember the one that was there the first. They're still old enough to remember Solomon's temple that was destroyed. We tend to say 70 years earlier. That may have been a little shorter than that, as early as about 42 or 43 years before that even. So maybe not that long before. In any event, they are crying, but they are being promised that the second will be greater than the first. Of course, that's going to happen way, way later, maybe in the Greek period, when in the Hashmonai period, we start to see expansions of the Jewish temple. And of course, it reaches its climaxes in the times of King Herod. So that's hundreds and hundreds of years later.
And the Hashmonaim are the Maccabees, of course.
Right. But I want to try to go back to your question and perhaps shed a light on another angle of that. And when you said who are the Jews, I want to try to look into their own dogma, their own Jewish philosophy. We start to see a change in what Judaism is all the way up to the First Temple period, and a new Judaism which is being created later. And again, I think Ezra is a part of it. I was looking for a name to describe who Ezra is, and I'm just going to drop the bomb on you and tell you that I think Ezra is a Messiah. I think he's a Mashiach in Hebrew. And the thing we need to remember about messiahs in Judaism is that we had many messiahs over the years. For the most part, they were unsuccessful messiahs.
Right.
Some big names everyone knows, Shimon Bar Kokhba from the Bar Kokhba revolt in the 2nd century, which ended up with the complete demise and destruction of this country. So a failure messiah, so much so that the chief rabbi of Israel, Rabbi Akiva, who supported him and nicknamed him, he coined the name Bar Kokhba, the son of the star, and thought of him as the one who will bring us back, if you will, to the times of Solomon. Ended up calling him Bar Kuziva, in other words, the one who despaired us, the one who let us down. Approximately 100 years before Bar Kokhba, there was another Jewish Messiah who wasn't accepted by a majority of Jews, but ended up creating the world's largest religion. So he's another Messiah. We've had Messiahs 250 years ago. There were still attempts to have Messiahs at the end of the Shabtai Tzvi, Yaakov Frank period. We had a Mashiach that is still perceived as a type of Messiah by ultra-Orthodox Jews that belong to the very specific subsect of Chabad. But I think Ezra is different than all the others because he is the only Messiah who will be considered a successful Messiah. He brought the Jews back. He wasn't the instigator, but then he gave them the push that they needed. together with Nehemiah, of course. And once arriving here, he realizes the challenges the Jews are dealing with, and he rearranges everything. He really does shuffle the deck of what Judaism was pre-Ezra and what Judaism is post-Ezra. And a lot to be said. A lot of good is done thanks to Ezra. A lot of things that maybe some people today will say, oh, that's actually not so great. But of course, that already becomes a subjective matter. And I'm really sort of debating with myself, what should I demonstrate it with? And I think I'll try to go into, at least in one or 2 points, let's try to talk about something that you've mentioned, these young Jews that are coming back to their ancestry land, although they may not have even been born in Israel, Judea, as it was known at the time. And although they're not Judean born, they have a very strong Jewish sentiment. But when they come back home, they discover that there are a lot of non-Jews living in towns where they used to live or nearby to towns where they used to live. They intermingle with the local society, and they marry the local girls there. As you've mentioned, in a patriarchal society, we can understand how the son gets up at the age of 18 and announces to his father that he's going home, and of course mom needs to just accept the news and cry at the door as he leaves. The daughters in that world had no such power, had no such ability. And we know that the local boys here, the Jews who have arrived here, are marrying into the local girls. And I haven't prepared it, but maybe I can find it real quick. Let's just see if I can find Ezra. And I'm just going to open that.
I find it very interesting. So basically, when Nebuchadnezzar takes the Jews out of Judea and into Babylonia, he doesn't take all the Jews. He leaves a lot of the poor ones here. But what Nebuchadnezzar used to do is, whatever nation he would conquer, he would take the people as slaves and he would settle them on the borders of his empire in a strange land. And what happened, so the theory goes, is the people that he took maybe from Afghanistan, maybe from somewhere else in Mesopotamia, and settled them in Samaria, just north of Judea, intermarried with the Jews who remained in Judea and created a new society, the Samaritans, which had some of our Bible. It was a little different, the Torah, the first 5 books of Moses, and the book of Joshua, with little differences. So they were kind of Jewish. They definitely had a Jewish base. So when the Jews from Persia came back, single young men, and took on these Samaritan wives, it seemed natural to them. But Ezra had a problem with it, correct?
Yeah, absolutely. Ezra has a problem with that. Like you said, the Assyrians who started the process of assimilation, and that led to dissolving the national identities, which were very strong before their time. It does climax there, and it goes on. But we also see, as you said, other groups moving in. What's interesting is that old religions constantly go through the molding and shaping. It's an ever-going evolution of religion. Of course, what will happen if you take Jews and you put them in another place? I don't care if it's on Alpha Centauri or in Babylonia. It really makes no difference.
Or America.
Or America. And then you bring them back together hundreds of years later after having almost zero communication. I mean, look at Ethiopian Jews who are coming back into Israel, suddenly facing a rabbinical system that continued the molding and shaping, and they had none of that. And now, are they Jewish? What is the definition of Jewish? Is it a race? Is it a religion? And so on and so forth. But I want to read to you what I found here from Ezra 10. If you don't mind, I'm just going to read 2 verses here from Ezra 10, verse 10. And I'm just going to use a Bible in English. I'm going to read from the New International Version, which is not as great as if you read the Hebrew, but it will pass. It will deliver in the message. The words in Hebrew are much more, they're coming out of the heart. And this is more a translation. But let's read it. So I'm reading verse 10 on chapter 10 on the book of Ezra, and it says that then Ezra the priest, Ezra a Cohen, and what does that mean? stood up and said to them, "You have been unfaithful. You have married foreign women, adding to Israel's guilt. Now honor the Lord, the God of your ancestors, and do his will. Separate yourselves from the people around you and from your foreign wives." In other words, Ezra is demanding that the Jews who are in Judea, that have returned to Judea, that have married foreign women, should separate and divorce these women. And there is an unusual, almost unprecedented agreement amongst Bible scholars that if we read into it, and we should read into it, we are seeing here one of perhaps the largest reformations in the definition of Judaism. And that is that up until the times of Ezra, without saying it, we are just extrapolating this from these two verses that I've just read to you. The definition of Judaism was anyone who had a Jewish father was considered Jewish. And from Ezra's moment onwards, it is everyone who has a Jewish mother.
Right.
Now, when I was younger, I tended to kind of go with the pragmatic answer of, well, those were the women that were here. Ezra is realizing that perhaps, you know, it's more popular. You're walking out in the street and you meet an Ammonite girl, and it's just something that you're unfamiliar with, and you end up getting married. And Ezra has a real concern towards the Jewish women, the continuation. Eventually, you know, we have a saying in Hebrew, Shema beni musar abicha ve'atitosh torat imecha, so that the values will come from the father, but the Torah, the way that you live your life, the derech, the road itself, is paved by mothers. And he's concerned that, you know, your mom is an Edomite mother, and she's going to have a little Edomite figurine there, even if there will be Shabbos candles on the other side. But mom is with you most of the time on those younger years, and this is what you'll end up being with. That was, for the longest time, how I understood Ezra's concerns. As I was thinking about it recently, I don't know if it is or isn't Corona related, I also stumbled on a number of articles that perhaps suggest that Ezra has an ulterior motive to this decision, which is perhaps not so ulterior, but perhaps the decision to divorce the foreign women is a manifestation of a much bigger philosophical understanding of Judaism that Ezra has, and that's a more universal approach of the Jewish God, of the Jewish deity. In other words, Ezra believes, and Ezra is a part of the group that wants the Jewish God to triumph above all others, and that there isn't room for a mixed family where mom is of one religion and dad is of another religion. Something that we see previously to Ezra in the books of the Bible before Ezra.
Right. Even with King Solomon, even with David.
Exactly. Foreign wives, those you take your pick. It's amazing. It's across the chronological timeline. David had foreign wives. Solomon had foreign wives before them. Samson, the great warrior judge, first and foremost, he is a judge. He is the leader of the Jewish people, chooses to marry a woman called Delilah.
Moses.
Moses married Zipporah. So if the narrative that you keep on hearing in the first 5 books of Moses is that our God is greater than all the gods, if you open the book of Ezra, if you open the book of Isaiah, which is a more or less of the same period, you start to read about the primacy of the Jewish God and how all the gods are really submitted to the Jewish God, so much so that eventually you're left with the understanding that they are false gods, as opposed to the biblical Jewish God, which is perhaps a bit more open towards the idea of having other deities, except he is the one who is true for us. He is our Elohim Shalanu. He is our Lord in a world of, I don't want to say a pagan world of a multitude of gods, but there's a recognition, and the other deities are called gods. But it ends with Ezra. He is putting the foundation to a new type of Judaism, a much more religious, a much more God in the center, and God is above all, which eventually put the foundation towards rabbinical Judaism. But that's in the chapters and the generations to come.
I like where you're going with this. And that's a good place to focus. I always focus when I'm talking about Ezra and Nehemiah that when the Jews were taken out of Judea, where they spoke Hebrew, and taken to Babylonia, where they spoke Aramaic, and over those 2 or 3 generations, Hebrew stopped becoming their language of speech, and Aramaic became the language, which we can see in the Kaddish. The mourner's prayer is in Aramaic. It's I don't understand it. So when they came back after Cyrus, who's actually called Messiah in Hebrew in the Book of Chronicles. So when Cyrus, who's a non-Jew, which is I always found that very interesting, that Cyrus is the one person in the Old Testament who's called Messiah, which means anointed one in Judaism. So when Cyrus tells the Jews to go back, and Zerubbabel leads them back, builds his little wooden temple where the old men cry in tears because it's a pathetic building compared to Solomon's, but the young men cry in joy because they never saw Solomon's temple, and hey, we have a temple, and they're speaking Aramaic. Ezra, when he finally comes, he goes into the markets, which are Mondays and Thursdays, and because the people speak Aramaic, they don't know Hebrew, so he stands up and he reads from the Torah in Hebrew, and has someone standing next to him translating it into Aramaic so that they would understand the law. And today we still read the Torah on Mondays and Thursdays, which is traditionally, it's still in a fool up here in northern Israel anyway, the market days in this land. Okay, why do we read the Torah on Monday and Thursday? Because Ezra had the Torah translated in the markets, because people weren't praying 3 times a day like we do now. So you're absolutely right, where Ezra leads this revolution of Judaism and changes it. To this day, we read from the Torah every Monday and Thursday and Shabbat. What else does he do? How does the whole synagogue meeting on the Sabbath, on the Shabbat, where you discuss the Torah and you pray to God instead of just going up to the temple 3 times a year for your sacrifice? Does Ezra have anything to do with the whole institution of the synagogue?
He does. Synagogues have already existed, not in the form that they exist today. I totally agree with you, and I like that you brought the Monday and Thursday Ezra work. And as you said, he also found it very difficult because people weren't understanding the Torah. I think the Talmud refers to Ezra's reformation specifically about that as part of his 10 major changes. The Talmud counts 10 tikkunim that are, how do you translate the word tikkun? Probably an alteration. An alteration, as if you're taking your suit and you grew, you're taller, you're bigger. That's what Ezra needs to do. He needs to make Judaism fit with the context. And the Talmud says that B'tchila, initially, Torah was given to Israel with the Hebrew writing and Hebrew tongue, and it was re-given to them. Listen to this. It was re-given to them in the times of Ezra with an Assyrian writing and an Aramaic tongue. And in other words, he translated, like you said, and eventually they were left with a synergy of the two, which is an Assyrian handwriting, but a Hebrew tongue. And that's what we still have today. In other words, when Moses comes with the Torah, it looks differently. Although it sounds the same, And Ezra makes it look differently and sound differently, but then towards the end of the life of Ezra, they found a way to balance the two. You had to learn the language. You're Jewish. You're expected to know the Jewish tongue, but we will let you read it however way you want. And if we're already talking about that, there's another Talmudic. It's not the same one that I've just recited to you, and I'm going to try to translate this as I go. And when the Talmud is referring to Ezra in another place, he is saying, "Re'uyat Torah shetinaten al-yedei Ezra." So the Torah was worthy that it will be given to the Jews by Ezra. Ela shehikdimo Moshe. In other words, Moses beat Ezra to it. But Ezra is such a big character that if he would have been the Moses, it would have been fine. And let's just remember, we have the Torah itself, the 5 books of Moses. The 5 books get perhaps the prime character of the first book, the book of Genesis, is Abraham, the founder of Jewish faith. We're all the sons of Abraham, all of monotheists, all of the religions of the world that fall under the umbrella of Abrahamic religion. So Christianity and Islam actually get under the umbrella as well. Moses takes over book 2, 3, 4, and 5. They are his books. Okay, he is the A-lister. He gets the most attention and exposure. And still, after everything that Moses does, the Talmud has no problem to say that the Torah could have been given by Ezra. And I dare say the version of the Torah that we have today is probably closer to Ezra than it is to Moses, because the context there is perhaps more relevant to our lives than the context in the lives of Moses. First, you have to separate people and offer an idea. Then you take those people and you turn them into a nation. But then for the first time, when they are struggling through hardship, and you collect them back together and you bring them back in, that's already the second stage. That's the second chapter. And that one is not the work of Moses. That one is the work of Ezra. Absolutely.
Wow. So very interesting stuff. Bena Mantel, thank you so much. I would love to have you back and maybe talk a little bit about the Talmud. What is it? How did it develop? I think you'd be a good guest for that. And I really appreciate you taking the time out of your day to spend with us. And I want to thank Jonathan Rose, our technical guru and Connie Nast Traveler Israel Specialist for 2020. There he is. Thank you again, Jonathan Rose. And I just want to say Shabbat Shalom to everyone. Have a happy Easter and a happy Pesach. And I hope to see you back here in Israel again when this whole pandemic Michigas is over.
Amen. Sooner than later, guys. Take care. Happy Passover.
Thanks a lot, Bena. Take it easy.
Take care. Shabbat Shalom.
Shabbat Shalom.